wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain, angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today, calling from Calvary's mountain, down from the crystal bright fountain.
All right, so we were talking about the land regulations that come under the heading of the laws concerning Jubilee, and I guess start back in verse 18 and go all the way through about verse 34. Had several questions about that, and we expanded the discussion last week to address those questions. I'll just kind of wrap it up by saying this. When we talk about justice with regard to things like this, justice depends on the standard. We often measure economic justice today in this place where we live by asking questions like, well, is each person allowed to enjoy the fruits of their own labor? The idea of someone working hard for something, developing something, and then not getting to enjoy the fruit of it is unjust. Leviticus measures justice a little differently than that. The laws here in Leviticus are not exclusively grounded in economics or any other mundane measure. They're grounded in what God has done. They are grounded in men recognizing God's authority, and they are grounded in God's distribution of his promises the way he sees fit. Once that principle is understood and accepted, the individual laws become a little bit easier to understand. We're going to get into tonight in just a moment one of the most controversial parts of the Bible in, well, I say in modern, you'll hear this argument a lot. If you go out into the community, especially if you go and talk to young people on college campuses who are, let me rephrase that. If you go talk to young people who are versed in YouTube theology, you'll hear this argument a lot because it is very appealing. And it's about the bondage question that he's fixing to get into and the rules regulating slavery. And that just flies in the face of the modern sensibility of what justice is. The idea of someone being enslaved is not just. And so, what of these regulations? Does that mean that God endorses slavery? Does that mean that God is okay with it? Understanding the principles that we're talking about right now, that everything is the Lord's, and that he has the right to determine its boundaries and its use and what it does and what it means and all of those things, makes it a little bit easier to understand, and primarily to understand what his purpose is. What is God's purpose for all of these laws of Moses? Okay, he does desire for the children to obey, but why did he give them? What's he trying to accomplish? Why did he allow Israel to enter into the land of Canaan and live there? Okay, he made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would dwell there. And so this is a fulfillment of that promise. But why did he even make the promise? What is he ultimately trying to accomplish? Redemption of man. That's at the core of all this. The reason why the nation even exists is because it is the mechanism by which he is going to bring in the Messiah in order to redeem us. And I will give you a hint. That word redeem, we've already seen a lot in this chapter. We're still yet going to see it more. It is a key term in this chapter. This is about redemption. And so all of these things ultimately are to preserve for himself a people who ultimately will bring his Messiah into the world so that he can redeem mankind from sin. He is trying to right the ultimate wrong. What was well, I hate to talk about it in the past tense, but I'm going to anyway. What was the most grievous thing to ever happen? For God's law to be transgressed the very first time. Now, that doesn't make it more severe than any subsequent time. But before that happened, things were different. And after that happened, everything changed. And now God has to act in order to put things back where they belong. That's the point of justice, is to put things back as close to right as is possible. And that is what God is doing, is trying to put things back as close to right. Before sin, God had complete fellowship with his creation. After sin, he did not. He's trying to make that right. This is part of the process. Now, there's a lot more to be developed. The law was never the mechanism to actually take away sins. The Hebrew writer gets very, very deep into that subject. But the law was integral in bringing about the mechanism that he put in place to take away sins. And it was instructive regarding those things. And so this is I'm going to pick on Wesley again because he's sitting there. And this is the part of music where you're not making music, but you're getting taught the things that you'll later use to make music. Everybody wants to know how to play an instrument, and they want to be able to just pick it up and play something. It doesn't work that way. Neither does salvation work that way. It wasn't that God could just, okay, he had to do things, and then he had to do them in a specific time frame and order in which to accomplish the purposes that needed to be accomplished, when they needed to be accomplished, how they needed to be accomplished. These laws are preserving Israel, not because Israel is so righteous. In fact, before they ever went into the land, they stood on the outside of the Jordan. This is a second group. First generation died in the wilderness. The second generation stood on the precipice on the other side of Jordan and was told, okay, now go in and I'm going to be with you and you're going to take the land, but it is not because of you. It is because of me. They were not so righteous that they needed to be protected and preserved because of their righteousness. God kept them and preserved them Even after he allowed them to be carried away a number of times, he preserved a remnant to bring back to accomplish a specific task that was mandatory if he was going to redeem man from sin. And that is what this is all about. These are things that were required in order to keep and preserve and accomplish those purposes. And it's in that way that they're just. Listen to 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. You can turn over there with me if you want. 1 Peter 1, 3 through 5. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Listen, here's where the language gets very interesting in connection with the things that we're studying right now. To obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. The preservation of Israel's inheritance in the land of promise anticipates this greater reality, that through Christ, God has provided an inheritance that cannot be lost, cannot be corrupted, cannot be taken away. And that's what we see going on here. They went in, the family was given a piece of property. They might be separated from that property for a while, but what did God ensure happened? They received it back. And again, keep in mind, I already mentioned redemption is an important theme through this chapter. And so keep that in mind as we talk about these things. And so as we go on, picking up the reading in verse 35 of Leviticus 25. Now, in case a countryman of yours becomes poor, by the way, countryman doesn't mean somebody that lives outside the city, a fellow Israelite. In case a countryman of yours becomes poor and has his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Just make sure we all understand what he's talking about here. What's he talking about? Yeah, not. I don't have a problem with using that word, but there's something much more fundamental under consideration here. Here's the deal. Something happens to me and I become indebted to you. He says, all right, here's the situation. I'm indebted to you and something terrible has happened and I'm not in any position to pay you back. He says, you can't just deal with that person however you want to. You must sustain him. Now, that is not what debt holders do to people by nature. Debt holders use their advantage over people to control them and manipulate them and dominate them and sometimes even crush them. He says you can't do that. Your job is to sustain them like a stranger. Or remember, he gave instructions about the strangers in the land and the sojourners in the land, about allowing them to glean and making sure that you treated them properly. You have to treat your countryman who falters in a debt to you in a way that you sustain him, that he may live with you. Do not take usurious interest from him. Usury is still a problem. Go to these payday loan places and find out how much they charge for a loan. You cannot take usurious interest from him, but revere your God. Notice the reason why. It has nothing to do with the person that owes you the debt. Revere God. You do this because of God, that your countrymen may live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain. For I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. So if your brother becomes poor and his means fail, you're to sustain him. He's to be treated, he says, as a stranger, as a sojourner. By the way, that just simply means according to the same principles that I outlined for them, so that he may live with you. There's the idea. Presenting a circumstance where even this person who is in a bad situation, who has faltered, can still live. How many people have a mortgage on their house? If you quit paying your mortgage, how long would you keep your house? Until the process of foreclosure could be carried out according to Louisiana law. That's how long you'd have your house. And they would take it from you and they would sell it. And where would you be? He is going to build some protections in that says, listen, these people in these circumstances, because of me, because of what I'm doing here, what I have done for you, what I'm doing with you, what I'm doing for all mankind, because of me, you need to treat them in a way that they can live with you. Revere your God, that your countrymen may live with you. Now, it's important to note this says countrymen. This is a fellow Israelite. All bets were off with foreigners that owed you money. Money is not to be loaned at interest. Food is not to be supplied for profit. Somebody needs food, you don't take advantage of them. You give it to them at a fair price. Why? I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. You're here because I brought you here. You have this land because I gave you this land. You didn't buy it. You didn't earn it. You didn't have a natural right to it. I gave it to you. I brought you here. You have property and you have crops and you have a home because I gave them to you. And I'm telling you, if your countryman is indebted to you, don't use that to harm them. Because I'm trying to do something with you. The Lord's redemption of Israel becomes a pattern for Israel's treatment of other people. Having received mercy from God, his people are not to exploit their brother's hardship for personal gain. That's what this is all about. This is the same principle that Jesus would teach later when he said, don't think that God is going to forgive you your trespasses if you're unwilling to forgive those who trespass against you. The exact same principle. Verses 39 through 46. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you. Well, what's it mean he sells himself to you? He makes himself a slave. You shall not subject him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and he shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought from the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold in a slave's cell. You shall not rule over him with severity, but are to revere your God. Again, you notice that the reason behind it. As for your male and female slaves, whom you may have, You may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they also may become your possession. In other words, you can hold them in perpetuity, and their offspring can become yours. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. Now, if the means of a stranger or of a sojourner with you becomes sufficient, and a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to him as to sell himself to a stranger who is sojourning with you, or the descendants of a stranger's family, then he shall have redemption right after he has been sold. One of his brothers may redeem him. I'm going to stop there. Probably read a little bit further than I needed to, because that gets into the next section that I want to deal with. He begins by saying this: an Israelite not to be treated, even if he comes to you and he says, look, I don't have anything, and I want to sell myself to you for service. What God is saying is, you can't do that. Instead, you must treat him as a hired man or as a sojourner. What does that mean? Okay, that's what a sojourner is, right? But what is it? What's he saying? You have to treat them as a day laborer or as a sojourner. What's the point in that instruction? What does that mean? Okay, and there's some specific rules about that. Okay, so if you put your finger here, flip over to Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15 real quick. We're going to find out what those rules are. This is what he is telling them. This is how you have to treat them. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your countrymen or one of your aliens, as your countryman or an alien, who is in your land or in your towns. You shall give him his wages on his day before the sun sets. What was the requirement? You pay them the day they work for you before the sunset. They shouldn't have to wait for their pay. If they work for you, you give them their money the very day they do the work. For he is poor and sets his heart on it. What does he mean? Listen, he's not doing this because he wants to do it. He's doing this because he didn't have a choice. What is that money to him? I tell you what it is. It's whether he eats or not. It's whether he can feed his wife and his kids or not. He has his heart set on it. He's taken that job and sold himself to you that day, sold his time to you that day because he is in need of that money. Don't make him wait for it, so that he might not cry against you to the Lord and it becomes sin in you. Understand what God is saying. If you do not treat these people right, it is a sin against God. So when he tells them, when your countryman becomes poor, he comes to you, wants to sell himself into bondage to you, you're not allowed to treat him like a slave. You treat him like a day laborer. You pay him for his work, and you pay him every single day that he works for you. Before the sun sets, you make sure he gets his wages. And he does this until when? Until the year of Jubilee. What happens at Jubilee? The trumpet sounds and liberty is proclaimed, and those obligations are relieved. Debt is relieved. Servitude is relieved. If you sold your property, it's relieved. You go back home, you go back to your family, you go back to your land, and you're at liberty. Free. Reason given? Well, it's a couple of things. Well, he returns to his family, to his children. He returns to the property of his forefathers. That was verse 41. Verse 42, for they are my servants. You can't hold them as slaves. Why? They're already my slaves. It's the same thing as the land. You don't own the land because it's my land. So you don't own an Israelite because the Israelites are my servants. And I am going to make sure that they eventually are set at liberty. I will redeem them. They're not to be sold at a slave sale, verse 42. They're not to be ruled over with severity, verse 43. You have to treat people with respect. The Lord commands, but you are to revere your God. All of this is to show your respect for God. When we get to the New Testament, Peter would write about wives, for instance, who have unreasonable husbands who are not good to them, but they should do what? They should submit to them anyway. Why? For the sake of the Lord. It's the same thing. The reasoning behind this is to show your respect to God. Why do we have to listen to the governing authorities? Are they always good? Do they always do the right things? No. Did the Roman government do the right things? And yet, to the Roman Christians, you get Romans chapter 13 that says, submit yourself to the authorities. Nero's the ruler. He's burning places down and killing people. And God says, submit to him as much as is possible. Where's the line? God comes first. The will of God comes first. Now, if you don't submit, what do you also have to be willing to accept? The consequences of that choice. What happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they refused to submit? They were cast into the furnace of fire. What happened to Daniel? What happened to Paul? And you know what's interesting about Paul is he says, when he's making his argument before the authorities who have control over him, is if I've done anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. You know what he's saying there? Look, if you find me guilty of something and that's what your judgment is against me, well, then that's the judgment that you have against me. Which is essentially the same thing that Peter and John said to the Jewish authorities. You decide whether or not what we're doing is wrong, but we must serve the Lord. Got the right two disciples, didn't I? In Acts 5, yeah, Peter and John. We have to be ready to accept the consequences of making that choice, which is a very, very hard thing to do sometimes. But why do we do all this? Why do we submit to these people who don't deserve it? Because of God. Israel's redemption from Egypt, and that's what God had done, was redeemed them from Egypt. Their redemption from Egypt permanently changes the way that they are to be treated. Those whom the Lord has redeemed belong to the Lord, and therefore they can't be reduced to perpetual slavery by another person. That's what he's saying here. But then there's the foreign slave things. These people are not redeemed. Now, we are getting taught something here. There is a real difference between being counted among the redeemed and not being counted among the redeemed. Male and female slaves may be acquired from the nations around Israel. They may also be acquired from the strangers that lived among them. By the way, the strangers that lived among them could also become wealthy enough to do what? we stopped. The last verse I read is the opening of that next section, which we're going to get to in a minute. I'm going to tell you what it is. It may be that the sojourners among you had money and you didn't have money, and all of a sudden you're in bondage to a sojourner. You sell yourself to a sojourner. And we're going to see how God deals with that situation. But that's a possibility. They can become an inherited possession for future generations. You can bequeath them to your children. They can be used as permanent slaves, in other words. Concerning fellow Israelites, though, you shall not rule over one another with severity. Now, we want to expand this a little bit further because these verses are very truncated and very focused. And because of this subject, and because it comes up so often, if you talk to people about God, I'm going to serve a God who condones slavery. I promise you'll hear that if you go to college campus and you talk to too many people. Somebody's been trained to offer that argument. That's not all God said. Exodus chapter 21 and verse 16. He said, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. It was a capital offense to kidnap someone for this purpose. All of the slavery talked about in Leviticus is what? Who's the instigator? The person that goes into bondage is selling themselves into bondage because they can't provide for themselves and they need help, and that's what's available to them. We're not talking about forced kidnapping. A master who killed a slave was subject to punishment. Please, Exodus 21:20. Serious physical injury. You know what happened if you injured your slave? You had to set him free. So even among the people that you had a right to possess, if you mistreated them, you lost the right to possess them. Slaves rested on the Sabbath along with everyone else. They had a day of rest. It was mandatory. Exodus 20 and 10 and Deuteronomy 5 and verse 14. Additionally, slaves were not viewed as property exactly. This is Deuteronomy 23 verses 15 and 16. Listen to it. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. So we got a situation where there's somebody's enslaved somebody and he escapes the situation. Let's just assume the master is not a very good guy and he runs away. And he comes to my house. This is God saying to me, you shall not give up to his master a slave who's escaped from his master to you. He's come to me. I don't bring him back to his master. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. Not exactly treated the way chattel property would be treated. It's impossible to equate this system with the Euro-African race-based chattel system that human beings engaged in, where they forcibly captured, traded as property, and with governmental sanction returned escapees to their masters when they escaped. Interestingly enough, it's my understanding if there was a runner, someone who tended to try to escape, one of the things that would be eventually done would be a foot would be taken to make it impossible for them to run. Under God's system, such behavior would render it a moot point because what would happen? He'd be freed. So what he's doing is setting parameters. limitations on how you treat people in this relationship. He didn't invent the relationship. He didn't say, go do this. He said, when you're in this situation and this relationship exists, and someone comes to you and enters into this relationship with you, you treat them properly and you care for them. And if they're your countrymen, you treat them like a laborer and not like a slave. Now, what happens? Let's say you get to Jubilee and it's time for all the slaves to be let go that are your countrymen. What happens if the person says, well, I don't want to go? I kind of like this guy. You're nice to me. It's a nice place to live. You're fair. I'm not going to be in any better shape if I leave here. So I just want to stay here with you. And I want to do it forever. Yeah, that was allowed. And you would take an awl, go up basically to your doorpost, put their earlobe against it, drive the awl through it, put a hole in their ear, and then they were permanently your slave. Why would they do that? Because you were good to them. And that's where they wanted to be under your care. And there is a connection between that imagery and what it means to be a servant of God. We should voluntarily want to be under his direction and control and voluntarily offer ourselves as a permanent possession. Why? Because of God's righteous treatment and care and provision. There's a wonderful exchange between Peter and Jesus when a bunch of people have left Jesus, and Jesus turns to the disciples and says, will you leave as well? Remember what Peter said to him? Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. No, we don't want to leave. We don't want to run away. We don't want to gain our liberty from you, because what you have for us is better than what we can get for ourselves. It's the same ultimate story as the prodigal son, who got his inheritance from his father and ran away for his freedom, but then realized what? It was better at his father's house as a servant than where he was at. And so all of this is building some parameters for how we look at people, how we treat people, how we value people, what we do with people. And it should not be misunderstood. It should be recognized for what God is doing here, which is saying, look, these relationships exist. You're going to do it, but you're going to do it in a proper way. And you're going to respect me by respecting them. All right, we got to stop. We're going to get to the next phase of this, which is what happens when an Israelite ends up getting sold to one of the strangers that's among them. There's an interesting conundrum, because the stranger may or may not want to respect God's Jubilee law. And so how is God going to redeem and care for these people? And we'll talk about that next time, Lord willing.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love.